this third part of theme 2, we're going to look at the research design itself. Basically, research design is just another way of saying this is the plan that we are going to use to do our research. So it's the logical structure of the study from the concept, so from where you've identified your problem, your questions, right up to how you analyze your data and write it up. And it makes sure that the data that we collect can answer our question as clearly as possible. Mainly your research design would deal with 4 issues. What kind of questions are you going to do? Which data are relevant to the study? What data do you collect? And how do you analyze the results? So in your research design, you have to describe those 4 things. It's a little bit like designing a building. If you look at the architect, when you design a building, you have to know the brief. You've got to know what the purpose of your building is, the scope and the budget that is available to you. And it's exactly the same thing with a research study. You have to know what is the purpose of your study. You need to know what is the scope of the study and what budget in time, just as money, but also the time that you have available to you. And now you develop a sketch plan, which is a vague outline. With your design research, you would develop a design which again provides you with a clear picture of what it is that you want to do. And in that sketch plan or in that design, you would identify what is the functional requirements that you need to meet the purpose of your building or the purpose of your study. So what do you need to do to meet the purpose of the study? You would also decide, when you're an architect, decide how you would meet your requirements. Same again with developing research studies. How will you meet those particular requirements? So what do you need and how will you go about meeting those requirements? What are the best materials and the tools for the job? Exactly the same kind of thing for the research design is what is the best type of data and the tools for your particular job. And now you have a detailed layout of what your design is. And you can prepare your specification. And in terms of research, you can say, well, what is the tests for validity? And you prepare your work plans. And now you have your Gantt chart that says, going to take me 6 weeks to do this. And while I'm doing this, I'm waiting for my ethics approval, for example. I can finish my literature review. And you figure out how you're going to go about it. Your research methodology deals with how you're going to meet the requirements, the type of data you're going to do, your design, and the tests for validity. Now we get different types of designs. And basically you have empirical research studies and you have non-empirical research studies. And non-empirical studies are those philosophical analysis or conceptual analysis or literature reviews. Whereas empirical studies is where you use either primary data that you've collected yourself from surveys or experiments, or you've been studying your case studies, or you've done an ethnographic study, or you analyze existing data. So you can analyze text data through things like discourse analysis, content analysis, textual criticism, or historical studies, or you analyze numeric data where you can do, for example, statistical modeling. A lot of your text and numerical data can also be helped to inform your non-empirical studies. But basic things with empirical studies is you go out and you collect data and you analyze data, and non-empirical study is where you use that eye of reason to come to the knowledge that you are developing. To give you a better idea of what the different types of research methodologies and research designs are that we find in the built environment, I suggest that you read this particular paper. Now, if we start looking at empirical design, means that it's based on observation or experience. So your researcher either experiences the phenomena or is an eyewitness to the events. It observes the events. You have direct access to the facts, and you get it in a number of domains, such as in the laboratory, where you can do experimental designs and controls, or you can observe or experience your phenomenon in the field, where you may have some kind of an experimental design, but you will not necessarily have a control to your experiment. Or you can do a case study where there's no real attempt to structure the research, so you don't have experiments, but you don't necessarily have controls or a design in there. You just simply observe what it is that you are seeing. Whereas with a laboratory or a field study, you can have a particular design, an experimental protocol that you've designed. The second type of major research design is archival design, which is where we use recorded facts, but it's not direct observation. So in empirical design, we have direct observation. Archival design, you have recorded facts. And there you can get your data, your primary data, say for original documents, invoices, purchase orders, or you have secondary documentation. So you don't have the invoice, you have somebody's record of the invoice, so that such as you would get in a financial report or a journal. You can also get physical facts that have been recorded, like fingerprints or footprints. And your different techniques here would include scanning, observation, sampling, and content analysis. Whereas with the empirical design, your techniques were mainly experimentation and observation. An analytical design, here we don't deal with external data that we've collected. Your analytical design is based on the internal logic of the researcher, and that logical can be inductive or deductive. And we use it to build theory, so it's inductive, or test theory, so it's deductive. And the formal techniques here that we get is usually from mathematics. Informal techniques comes from philosophical arguments and the various ways of doing with philosophical arguments, building scenarios, or by building up a series of yes and no questions. An opinion design is the one that we most often find that students like to do, which includes the views and the judgments of individuals or groups, so the opinions of people. So you don't observe the fact, you ask people what their opinions of that particular fact is, and this is where we use things like questionnaires or interviews or opinion polls or brainstorming, or the Delphi technique where you ask groups their opinions, and if there's no consensus, you circulate all the various opinions, and you then ask people to revise, and you do this until you have a consensus, or where it becomes apparent that it's not possible to achieve consensus. So the difference between the research design and research methodology is the research design helps you to describe what is the kind of study you're going to do, so which methodological paradigm are you working in. It starts from the research objective, and it focuses on the logic of the research and the kind of evidence or the data that you need to connect. Your methodology is then the next step, which is about the process. So the design is the overall thing. The methodology is about the process and the tools that you need to use to achieve that design and to make that design come to life. And you deal with specific tasks that you have to complete, your objectives, and it would focus on individual steps within the research process. So research methodology then is the process of collecting and analyzing the data, and it describes the means, so the techniques and the tools by which you would collect your data. And you get a number of different instruments that you use to gather data. For example, an astronomer would use a telescope, a biologist a microscope, a sociologist would use questionnaires, and a psychologist would do tests and observations of behavior. And all of those are what we call research instruments. So for example, when we were in our teaspoon study collecting data, they counted the teaspoons at regular intervals, they calculated the half-life, they administered a questionnaire. So that was the design of the study. So can we go and test yourself further and say, can you identify the type of research design that was followed? And can you set out in detail the steps that were followed? So the exact research design for this particular study. So the next lecture we're going to talk about how do I choose my most appropriate methodology. Thank you.